sbodily with IBM. I'm part of the Advanced Technical Skills team located out of Dallas, Texas. And I'm about to demonstrate how to dynamically add a new node into an existing and active PowerHA cluster. Now this says a third node because the huge majority of clusters are two-node clusters, and in my demonstration I also start with a two-node cluster, but this process can be used to add any new node into an existing cluster. So having said that, let me give an overview of my environment. I have a simple two-node cluster, happens to be a pair of 750s. I have two nodes listed as HA4A and 4B. Everything with an A happens to be on one 750, everything with a B is on another 750. Not really relevant to the demonstration, but they are on separate frames. They are virtualized with dual VIO servers. I am using currently the latest that is available, PowerHA 712 SP1, and the same levels for AIX. So I have what is considered a pretty typical cluster, a two-node hot standby cluster configuration, and I'm going to add a third node into the cluster. I'm going to do this for a couple reasons. One, I'm tired of hearing about all the things that cannot be done in an active cluster, which is extremely few and far between. There's very few things you cannot do in an active cluster. So I want to demonstrate many of these things that can be performed live, including adding another node into the cluster. I'm also going to follow up this demonstration with a couple of other demonstrations of other capabilities with PowerHA utilizing this three-node cluster. So keep a lookout for additional demos. What I'm going to do now is actually give you an overview of what the steps required to perform this change dynamically are. Of course, PowerHA has to be installed on the target node, the new node that's going to be added into the cluster. We need to make sure that the shared disks that we're dependent on are already known to the new node along with the PVIDs being displayed. Not worried about the volume group information. I'll show you how to deal with that. But we must have the PVIDs existing for both the cluster repository disk and any data disks we may have. We also need to make sure that etc hosts has all the appropriate information in it for all the nodes in the cluster, including the new node that we're adding. So all three of them must know about each other's interfaces. Need to make sure CLCOMD is active, which is enabled by default anyway. Update the etc cluster rhosts on all three nodes to make sure that they each know about the IP address that resolves to the host name of each node. Refresh CLCOMD. Then we're going to add the node into the cluster. I'm going to use SMIT to demonstrate it. So I will show you how we can do a pick list and add that node into the cluster. And then when we add the node, we're going to synchronize the cluster. And I'll explain this also while we're doing it. But when we synchronize the cluster that first time after adding the node, it will add the node into the CAA cluster and into the HA cluster, and we won't have to add any new cluster topology at all. The interfaces will be automatically discovered and the appropriate interfaces added to the proper network already existing in the cluster topology. Just like when you create a new cluster, the same thing happens, but it's nice to show that you don't have to manually add the interfaces into the topology. Now, I go ahead and synchronize the cluster at this point for adding it into the cluster like I mentioned, because it helps me later. The next steps would be add the node into the resource group if desired, and in my case I'm going to do that. Also, since it will be a participating member of the resource group, it needs to know about the shared data volume group. So I will show that when we add it to the resource group, there's actually this option about automatically import the volume group. We will use that option and it'll pull it in for us. So we don't manually have to import the volume groups. And then we will synchronize the cluster again to make that node known as a member of the resource group, and then we simply start cluster services and add it in to the running cluster. So with that, I'm going to exit out of this and swap over to my PuTTY sessions. So what I have here is a PuTTY session for each one of my nodes. 4A is considered the primary node. 4B is currently the backup, and you can see on 4B I have a cluster status tool called QHA running, and it is showing me that the resource group is online on 4A. It's got a service IP address. It's got a database volume group. Both are active in the cluster. 4B is just sitting there as a standby. And down at the bottom is 5A, and 5A is going to be the new node that I'm going to add into the cluster. So first thing I'm going to do on 5A is prove that the cluster file sets are installed. So I've got PowerHA already installed. I need to verify that the etc hosts has the information about the other nodes and itself configured here. So we can see we've got both sets of IP addresses listed here. So my etc host is correct. You would also do the same thing on the original primary nodes. Make sure that 4A and 4B know about 5A as well. Then also we need to make sure that the etc cluster R hosts has the IP addresses in it for the hostname IP address for each node in the cluster. So we can see here, I've got all three listed here. I will run the same thing on 4A and 4B, and actually there's a nice little command that you can run for existing clusters called clcmd, where it'll run the same command on each node of the cluster. So you can see here 4B has all three IP addresses, and so does 4A. So all the etc host and the etc cluster R host is currently correct. What else I need to do is to perform a refresh -s on clcmd to make sure it knows about all those addresses. So I'm going to do the same thing on all the systems. Okay, so it's been refreshed everywhere. My cluster is active and stable. So now I'm ready to add the third node, which is HA5A, into the cluster. Now, I'm going to do this from 4A. It really doesn't matter if I do it from 4A or 4B. I'm only doing it from 4A, so we can continue to watch the cluster status as this happens. So I'm going to move these windows around a little bit. So I'm going to use the normal SMIT menus to add this node. Cluster nodes, manage nodes, add a node, and for the node name you can type in anything you want. I'm going to make it match the host name, which is a common thing to do. It's not required. The only thing that is required is that this communication path must resolve to the host name IP address. So I can make the node name be something else, but the communication path must point to the host name IP address. Again, it's common practice that they match. They don't have to for the HA cluster. For the CAA cluster underneath the covers, it is required that they match. So much like when you create a cluster originally, when you're adding another node into the cluster, it does this discovery. So it pulls up, it'll discover all the disks that it knows about and the interfaces, and that'll be used again later for figuring out what are the shared disks and for configuring the cluster topology. Now at this point, all I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sync up the cluster, and this is actually going to take a couple of minutes for this to run. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it running on top, and I'm going to show on 4B the cluster status. You're going to see it process information. You're going to see it run some topology changes, And you can see here that during this, there's cycling of some of the daemons. So we'll have intermittent interruptions in the cluster status, but it does not affect the cluster itself. So it is stable. This is dynamically changing and not impacting the resources or the resource group. And once this is completed, I'll show you a couple things. One, we'll see on the QHA output that there's a new node that's part of the cluster. I'll also show you over on 5A that it is included in both the CAA cluster, and we will see the topology information has been pushed over to 5A as well. Now, 5A isn't a part of the resource group yet, nor does it know about the volume group that is a resource in the resource group, but that's actually going to be our next steps after this add is completed. So also while this is running, I can take a peek over here on 5A, and I can see that with CAA VG private now active, that 5A has been added into the CAA cluster. So I can actually run some of the ls cluster commands, and it hasn't fully activated yet. So it hasn't completed, even though we see the CAA VG private. But by the time this completes, I can also show you that since it's not completed yet, we probably have limited, we do have 5A, it's already showing up in there. So the cluster topology is showing the HA 5A interfaces. And once this gets completed, we will see that the 5A is part of the CAA cluster as well. So now you can see on QHA that it has showing that HA5A is now part of the cluster with the status of ST init, and that's actually normal. It just means that it's become part of an HA cluster, but it's not active in the cluster. So ST init, just because you add a node in the cluster doesn't mean that it starts the node in the cluster for you. We're actually going to do that last after we make the changes to the resource and resource group. So you can see here that it's doing a reconfigure topology, but even while it's doing the reconfiguration of topology, it does not impact the production resource group. So the resource group is not being moved, it's not affected by this. This is all being changed live and dynamically. So we're getting close to it finishing here. The cluster is now showing stable again. And we can look and see that we have an OK from the sync and verify. So we've seen the topology down here. We've seen that it is now part of the CAA VG private has been brought in, and if we do an ls cluster, we can now get all the output that says all 3 nodes are part of the CAA cluster. So you can see here that actually HA5A was added to the top, and that we have 3 nodes reported in the cluster. So that's all completely normal. You can also see that it doesn't know anything else about any data volume groups. Everything shows none. And I'm also going to show that it's not part of the resource group currently. We still only have 4A and 4B in the resource group. So again, it doesn't matter which node I make this change on, as long as I change it from an active node in the cluster. So it has to be 4A or 4B. Just out of habit, I'm going to continue to use 4A. So now we're going to go back and we're going to add 5A into the resource group. And here you can actually do an F4 and get a pick list, or you can type it in. When you do a pick list, it will put it in alpha sort for you. Sometimes you don't want that. In our case, it just happens to work out that it would work out to be alphanumeric sort anyway, but I still manually type it in out of habit. So now all that did was just update the ODM on 4A. The other thing we have to do now is that 5A doesn't know about the shared volume group. We see here we've got something called DBVG. And I can actually show you over on 4B that DBVG is active in concurrent mode, happens to be HDisk 6, ends in 23A8. And if we look at 5A, you'll also see HDisk 6, 23A8. The HDisk name doesn't have to match, but you want to prove that the PVID exists, so it knows about everything it needs to know for this to be successful. So I'll go back to running the cluster status on 4B. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose this option to automatically import the volume group. Now this actually occurs, I'm going to set it to true, and it actually occurs at the time that you hit enter. It doesn't occur, it doesn't wait for a sync and verify. It occurs right at that moment of striking enter. So you can see it already gave me the OK prompt, and of course since it's an enhanced concurrent volume group, it will not automatically activate the volume group. So if we look on HDisk 6 now, we can see that DBVG exists. If it didn't exist, if it wasn't known about, if we tried to sync up the cluster without it existing, it's actually going to error out. And because it's an active cluster, Autocorrective Actions will not fix it in an active cluster. Autocorrective Actions fix inactive cluster configuration problems. So this prevents us from having to do anything manually. We can just use the option that HA gives us to do that for us, and now we just verify and sync the cluster up again. And this too, because it does a verify, this will actually take a couple of minutes for this to run completely. All it's really doing is pushing the new resource group configuration over, but it also verifies the resources of the resource group are known about on every node in the cluster. In this case, we're more specifically concerned about HA5A with it being added to the cluster. And actually, while this runs, I'm actually just going to pause this for a minute just in an effort to speed up the demo. We can see that it too is now going through some reconfiguration events again. And now we can see that the event processing has completed. The synchronization has come back okay. Everything is in sync. The cluster is stable. And if I look over on 5A now, we can see that the resource group information has been updated, and 5A is now a member of that resource group. So it is a failover candidate node. Everything is in sync. The only thing that we have left to do now is simply start the node to have it join the cluster. So anytime a CL start is performed, a verification is run to make sure that things are in sync. So the verification takes a minute or two for it to actually complete. So as we wait for this, I'm just going to pause the screen for a second to speed this up, speed the recording up a little bit. You can see here that it's running the verification at the bottom. Now it says starting cluster services. You're also probably very aware that when you start cluster services, it's normal to get this OK back fairly quickly. But that doesn't mean it's truly started yet. If we look over here on the QHA output, you can see that it's actually joining the cluster. Now, that node down complete, it's not really running that event. It's actually the last entry in the log from previous. So now it's running the node up. You saw there for a second that you saw something called voting. And since HA5A doesn't own any resources at this point, there's really not much for it to do. So that took probably a little bit over a minute for it to actually join the cluster. But you can see now that I have a completely stable cluster with all 3 nodes in it. And with that, I will conclude the demonstration of dynamically adding a node into a PowerHA cluster. If you have any questions about this demo or any other demo, or suggestions for more demos, feel free to utilize my email address that I showed at the beginning of this demonstration, which is sbodily@us.ibm.com. Thank you.